It is with great pleasure to welcome Alex Edmans to the webinar. Alex is on pretty much any dimension in this profession a superstar. Alex got a PhD from MIT in finance. He afterwards became an assistant professor of finance in Wharton. Easily or very clearly, I would say, one of the best kind of finance business schools on earth. Afterwards, he got tenure at Wharton, which is an incredible accomplishment. And afterwards, he actually became a full professor at London Business School, where he continues to be. One thing which is so remarkable beyond Alex, it's very disciplined actually to be very successful in any kind of academic discipline. What's so remarkable about Alex is that he's kind of, how should I say, he's gone a little bit above the boundaries of his discipline. So very often kind of inspired by a financial angle. He has actually then contributed to very different topics, and he's very engaged in the kind of public debate. And I think that's another thing which makes him so special. He doesn't just, and that's already a major accomplishment, publish in top A journal academic publications, but he's really a participant in the public debate. So he writes a blog. I can highly recommend the blog. If you haven't yet checked it out, go to his website, read the blog. He's kind of speaking out in parliament and so on. So he's really a participant in the kind of public debate. So in many ways, I would say for many academics, he's when I mentioned to colleagues that Alex is on the podcast, he's like, oh, he's in many ways like a role model. I want to be like Alex. We should all be a little bit more like Alex. And so you learn something about Alex also when you read the book. So that's probably not the primary motivation, but you learn a little bit about his family, how he approaches his family life. His son Caspar is mentioned in the book, and kind of how he uses the angle of being very careful about evidence also in his family life. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for writing the book. I had the chance to read the book. It's a fantastic book. I enjoyed it a lot. I had an early copy. I said in my LinkedIn post, I wish I had read this book 10 years ago. Actually, I wish I'd read this book 20 years ago. And I wish a lot of the people I interact with or politicians had read the book. I will not just do the talk, but I will do the walk. I plan actually to assign parts of the books to PhD students I teach. I think it's a very great way, a great introduction, how to think better about kind of causal evidence, about how to think about studies, how to conduct good studies, how to read studies more carefully, how in generally to be more thoughtful about kind of the evidence that is presented to you. There are a bunch of reasons why I believe you should read the book. Look, it will simply, in many ways, on a very kind of selfish kind of evidence, it will make you smarter. It will allow you to make better decisions, okay? And more generally, I believe it will make the world a better place because it will help you to help your organizations run better. It will render you more skeptical, more thoughtful of kind of evidence that is provided to you. Beyond that, it's also simply a joyful book to read. I had great fun when reading the book. There are many fun examples in the book. And beyond that, they're also beautiful examples. The examples are really there to illustrate the core concepts, but you also learn a bunch of stuff about soccer. You learn about pregnancy. You learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Alex has a beautiful way to kind of draw on fantastic ideas and really integrate them and to say like, look, how can I not just kind of make my point, but also kind of, can I make it entertaining and interesting for the reader? Alex, thank you so much for joining the ensnared webinar Between the Lines.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great that so many people have joined. Really appreciate everybody's engagement and excitement on LinkedIn. After slaving away at the book for a couple of years, it's really gratifying when people are interested in hearing what it's about. So thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Alex, very simply, what motivated you to write the book?
So as you mentioned, Henning, at the start, very kindly, what I try to do as a professor is not just to do academic research to be published in the top academic journals, but to engage with practitioners. So you and I both work at business schools. We do research to profoundly affect the way the world does business. But then when I engage with practitioners, be this executives or investors or policymakers on the findings of research, not just my research, but the research of the broader community of scholars, what I notice is how people responded to the research would not be based so much on its accuracy and its rigor, but whether people liked the findings. So if there was a paper showing what people thought to be true, it was the world's best paper. And I wouldn't even call my own papers the world's best paper. Whereas if you had a paper which contradicted what people thought to be true, then people said this is just an academic paper. It's got no relevance to the real world. And so I thought, well, then what is my role as a finance professor and the role of all my colleagues? If we just produced research, but the impact that the research had on the real world was almost exclusively based on whether people liked it, then what are we doing as a profession? We end up just talking to each other. Some of the most innovative research, which goes against the grain, it might take some time to actually seep through. So rather than just doing another academic paper, I wanted to speak out for the role of research careful thinking in general. And notice this is not just about academic papers. Many people on this webinar might never read a single academic paper in their life, but whenever you pick up a copy of, say, Men's Health or Women's Fitness or Runner's World, you are reading research on how best to train for a marathon. Whenever you're choosing to breastfeed or bottle feed your child, you are using the insights of research. Whenever you pick up a self-help book or listen to a TED Talk podcast on how to improve yourself, you are being based on the findings of research. And I wanted to make sure that the research that we are learning from is the research that is accurate, not the research we want to be true.
You know, Alex, I like your formulation there, you're reading research, but this is not how people might actually see this, right? You see, like when you consume a TED Talk, you might not actually think of it actively as research. Can you kind of unbundle this a little bit? Like, you see, like to me, it's basically people make a statement about how something causes something, right? How some X causes some Y, and they kind of make some kind of claim, right? So when you say research, it's a very broad kind of definition, right?
You're absolutely right, Henning. I want to get people to think more broadly about what research means. So when I was at high school, I studied history, and in history, you examine evidence. And what counted as evidence in history? A photograph could be evidence. A single diary by a historical figure counted as evidence. They were not narrow as to what counted as evidence. And similarly, anything that might inform us, which is based on somebody learning about the world, that could be seen as research. Now, there's research of different degrees of rigor, but you could see a blog post about how waking up at 5 a.m. every morning changed my life. That is research. That's somebody giving their account on how they started a habit and it had a particular effect, just like a historical person's diary or a particular photograph. And so given we're exposed to so many different types of information, some might be peer-reviewed academic studies, others might be long-form journalism, others might be smart thinking books, and others might be TED Talks or podcasts. There's so much information out there. I wanted to highlight, well, what information can we learn from and what information is actually more flimsy than what we'd like to believe.
Alex, you do this in the book. I would kind of do this in a little bit different order. I would kind of start with the production function before we kind of go into the consumption function, so to speak. Why is there so much flimsy research?
So if I start with the production functions, why is there flimsy research? The payoff to doing flimsy research is huge. So who might do flimsy research? So some of such research could be done by consultancies, and their goal is not publication in a top academic journal. It is not scientific inquiry, but it is to release whatever paper improves their public relations. So you often see at the back of these documents, it says this is a marketing communication. So the goal is not research, but good PR. So if you're a McKinsey, a paper which shows ethical companies perform better or more diverse companies perform better, that is what will get you seen as a beacon of corporate ethics or diversity that will get widely shared and popular, compared to a study finding that ethical behavior has no effect on profits. So if you're a company, then what is your incentive to produce flimsy research? It is great PR. Now, you know that whenever you point one finger at somebody, you have three fingers pointing back at you. So let's point back to the academic profession. Why might academics have an incentive to produce flimsy research? It's pretty similar. Right? We have this idea that academics are perfect people who are immune to the biases of everybody else. But no, academics are people too. And academics do want to have an impact and they do want to get famous. And this is not for a bad reason, right? It's important for academic research to impact the real world rather than just to sit in a silo. But one way, again, to be impactful and to have a great TED Talk and great books is to say what people want to be true. And so the second best viewed TED Talk of all time by Amy Cuddy on the idea of power posing, that's something people wanted to be true. If you were to power pose before a job interview or a public talk, then you'll perform better. Similarly, the work of the likes of Francesca Gino on a topic that people think is interesting on dishonesty, that is potentially the result of dishonesty itself. And maybe this problem has got worse over time because now as academics, given the likes of TED Talks and books which can go viral, academics have the potential to be able to monetize some appealing findings much more than they did in the past.
Alex, you do one thing in the book that I very much admire, but I would love to kind of understand your motivation, because it's a little bit uncommon. You do not pull your punches. You're very explicit in the book. You kind of point to Amy Cuddy, you point to the McKinsey study, you kind of refer to Simon Simonek, you kind of go to the Walter Isaacson HBR article. So you're very explicit in pointing out things that you find problematic, and you kind of name these people. And I have enjoyed this a lot. I think I personally think it's actually important to kind of call out kind of institutions or call out people who engage in, let's call it, flimsy research. But I would love you to kind of share a little bit your motivation to do so, the consequences of doing so. Yeah.
Thank you so much for asking about that, Henning, because on the one hand, people might say, oh, why is he criticizing these people? Is this unkind? Is this snarky? Is this sort of making fun of people for making mistakes? I don't think so. So I view my role as an academic to help with disseminating research. And so part of this might be myself disseminating my own research and making sure that it's rigorous. But I also spent 6 years as managing editor of a leading academic journal. And then I needed to make sure that papers which could have had a huge amount of impact, but were not fully nailed and were not fully correctly drawing the conclusions, I ended up not publishing them. And so that should also, I think, be the same with information which is already out there and circulating. If there are studies that are widely being circulated and are not correct, then people need to call attention to them, just like studies claiming that vaccination leads to autism or that opioids don't lead to addiction. That did cause a lot of damage before people pointed it out. So why does it end up being me who are sometimes will call this out? Well, one of the fields that I work on is sustainability. And that is a field in which there's a lot of research nowadays because this is something which is very popular. This might be the importance of caring about wider society, having a purpose starting with why, as Simon Sinek has, talking about the importance of passion and effort, as Malcolm Gladwell highlights when he talks about 10,000 hours. So this is a topic I've done a lot of research on, and I'm also generally supportive of ESG and sustainability and responsibility. So if I express some concerns about a study, it's not due to ideology. It's not because I'm a right-winger who's anti-sustainability. I am a supporter of it, but I want to make sure that it is supported by rigorous evidence and not wishful thinking. And
Alex?
also one thing that we do as academics, sorry to continue, is that part of our job is to be discerning. So as a referee for a journal, you give a fair view of the paper. As a discussant at the conference, you are appointed to give an unbiased opinion of the paper, not to say nice things so that people will give you a favor in response. So one might say, okay, it's unkind to point out problems, but I think it's even more unkind to the audience of academics, which is the general public, if you see an issue and you don't point it out. And the way I'll try to highlight and the way I will try to point out the issue is not to be destructive. I'll try to point it out in a fair and professional way. For example, if I was to say this study on ESG is weak, This doesn't debunk the ESG movement in general. There's a lot of other great ESG studies. I'm just focusing on this particular study so that I make sure it doesn't come across as a personal attack or something based on ideology.
I think in particular on what you just said, you do a beautiful job, for example, in the context of the Walter Isaacson biography on Steve Jobs, where you actually say, like, look, this is a beautiful and kind of inspiring story of Steve Jobs, and is absolutely no problem whatsoever. The moment he then writes an HBR article about and say, like, look, this is what CEOs in general can learn from Steve Jobs, it becomes much, much more problematic, because now he actually kind of claims generalizability of the study, which might actually just not be present. I would like to make it for the viewers or listeners a little bit more kind of concrete. Alex, could we talk about like one or two studies? Pick any study you like. It could be Amy Cuddy's study. It could be the McKinsey kind of long-term focus study, whatever kind of study you like, where you kind of take one or two study where you say, like, look, this is what they say or what they claim, and this is how you found it problematic.
Certainly, yes, it's good to make it concrete. So let's think about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours rule. So that is frequently interpreted as the idea that if you spend 10,000 hours practicing a skill, you can master it. So first, let's start with the producer. So why has this become so viral? Well, it's something that everybody wants to be true. Right, and therefore, if you share that message, you know that your book will go viral, and his book Outliers became a bestseller. And why do we want this to be true? It's because it accords with our values. We learn from a young age, you can do anything that you put your mind to. Practice makes perfect. So Malcolm Gladwell's claim that if you practice, you'll succeed, that's something which has been extremely popular. His book Outliers is mainly known for that rule, and that rule only, even though it only occupies one chapter out of the entire book. So what was the evidence for that rule? So he took one study of violinists. Well, again, let's just pause there. He took a study on violinists. And yet when you hear Gladwell talk about the rule, he claims that this rule applies to any complex setting. He puts chess, neurosurgery as examples, but a study on violin playing might not apply to neurosurgery. These are very different things. With a violin, you play a specific piece of sheet music, but neurosurgery, there's a lot of randomness being involved, so what works in one might not work in another. Then look at the actual violin study. What they did was they took 10 best violinists. 10, not thousands. It was just 10 people. So the secret to success, how can you identify success from those 10 people? And note that those 10 people were not best violinists, but 10 violinists as judged as being good by the instructors at the Berlin Academy of Music. So they hadn't achieved anything. They'd not got to a great orchestra. They were music students, and their teachers were judging their potential. So why is that problematic? Well, what Gladwell tried to show was the more you practice, the better the outcome. And so that might be the direction of causality. Practice leads to success. But if indeed teachers were judging their ability, there could be causality. It could be quite different. It could be because teachers knew that they were practicing a lot, they might automatically say, okay, these people must be good. Like violin playing, it's quite difficult to measure that objectively. So it might be the perception of somebody practicing a lot leads to the teachers judging them as having performed well. So if Outliers is the book, The Story of Success, that was his subtitle. It didn't actually measure success, it was perceptions. Let me just do two more. I could give 10 more issues with the book, but let me just stick with two more. Another thing is that it didn't actually measure how much students had practiced. What they asked was the students, who are now aged 18, how much they practiced when they were aged 5. Now, that was 13 years ago. Can you remember what you were doing 13 years ago? Probably not. And again, it could be causality is in a different direction. If you're doing really well now, you'll probably overestimate how much you practice. You might think, I'm doing really well, I must have worked really hard to get this far. Whereas if you're not doing that well now, even if you practice a lot in the past, You'll probably deny that you did that practice, just like if you did a marathon, got a bad time, you typically say, I didn't really train for it. And the final thing, most strikingly, is 10,000 hours was never mentioned in this study. So how did Gladwell come up with the 10,000 hours rule? It was a nice round number. It gamifies personal betterment for everyone. If you reach 10,000 hours, you'll be a star, just like Fitbits tell you to do 10,000 steps. But this was something not at all supported by the research on which he based his rule.
So, Alex, let me push back a little bit here. Okay, so everything you say makes total sense for me. But let's say from this kind of insight from the 10,000 hour rule, people kind of one of the things they take away is to say like, look, I just need to practice a lot, or like practice is highly correlated with like success, or practice not just correlated, but practice actually tends to cause success, right? Which I think is a rather fair statement to do, right? Um, so isn't it that sometimes these kind of, how should I say, that you see like Carl Weick has this example of an army that kind of gets lost, right? And it gets lost, an army gets lost in the Pyrenees, and if I recall this correctly, and they find out with the help of the map, but later they find out that it wasn't a map of the Pyrenees, but it was a map of the Alps. So whether this anecdote is actually true is a big matter of debate. But I sometimes, you see, like when reading the book, and I'm very impressed by what you've done here. So I'm fully in your camp, Alex. I'm kind of taking a little bit of a counter position here to understand it better. Isn't it that sometimes we want these oversimplification, so to speak, to do the right thing? You see, like when is it can be wrong, but still be helpful.
I think it's a very fair challenge, and please don't apologize for challenging me. One of the big themes of the book is the importance of hearing dissenting viewpoints. And your view is entirely reasonable. You might think, am I being too nitpicky on Gladwell? Was his rule not just saying the general idea that practice makes you better? Isn't this encouraging the growth mindset, saying that irrespective of genetics or personal background, if you try at something, you might get better? Shouldn't that be something me as a finance professor, as an educator, would want to promote? And I would say, yes, to an extent, that is a good message. But I think there's many ways in which you can go wrong by listening to Gladwell. The first is he highlights only the number of hours of practice, which is quantity rather than quality. When you go back to the original violin study, even disregarding the fact it was only on violins, taking it at face value, it never claimed that the more the hours, the better the outcome. What mattered was the type of practice that you were doing. Deliberate solo practice, which is seen as uncomfortable, that is actually quite different to a jam session where you're just playing for fun with other people. It's just like, how might you practice, say, sports? Would you practice tennis by doing tennis drills over and over again, where a coach teaches you how to serve and you make tiny adjustments? That is painful. And that might not be as fun as just knocking the ball around with friends, but just giving this the idea that any type of hours spent counts. That's something which is misleading, but it is appealing. Another concern is that it suggests that if we try at anything, irrespective of talent, we'll be successful. And there might be certain things that no matter how much time I put in, I won't succeed. For example, I would never become a great ballet dancer or even singer, no matter how many hours that I put in. So we do have limitations because of our ability. But that message, people don't like to hear that message. Why? Because it suggests that there's constraints on us. We can't indeed do everything we put our mind to, which is what we were told as kids.
You see, my question was, so thanks for this. This is helpful. I think the thing which kept on puzzling me is, given that these things are so flimsy and in some cases fraudulent or kind of misdirecting, I kept on wondering myself, why do these kind of studies continue to be so popular? Why do they stay around for so long? And you talk about these, and we'll go into this in greater detail in a minute. You talk about the biases, but I kept on wondering if there's some kind of rationale why people buy into this stuff, so to speak. If there's some kind of of benefit. You see, like there were these kind of, there were, for example, in the 1980s, where there were these books on re-engineering, and like a lot came out of St. Gallen. Oh, managers have to surf on the chaos. And people said, like, look, there's not much actually help in there, but it kind of calms people down to a certain degree in a very complex environment. So I kept on thinking, given that these studies or this kind of research, this kind of advice is so wrong, why does it continue to be so popular? And I buy your argument about the biases. I fully get that. But I wondered if there's an additional kind of rationale in how it kind of helps people. That might be a good moment to jump a little bit more into the consumption function of these kind of flimsy research. And you've already alluded to this a little bit. Why do we buy into these studies, right? Katie Milkman at Wharton, for example, actually showed, I believe, at some point that the science section in the New York Times is the one which goes the most viral, in fact, right? So what are the things that make this kind of flimsy research so appealing, Alex?
Yeah, that's a great place to now go. So let me start with the positive side. So a lot of these flimsy type papers, these are ones on self-betterment and self-improvement. So they're people genuinely trying to get better, develop good habits, to lose weight, to become more efficient, and so forth, be more productive with their time. And that's why I didn't know Katie's statistic, but I fully believe that these are the things that go viral. So that's great on the one hand. Anything which is actionable and practical will go viral. But then what is the problem? So let's go back to Danny Kahneman, who, like Katie, is a behavioral economist, and he passed away, unfortunately, a few weeks ago. What he highlighted was there's two ways of thinking. There's the rational thought process, which knows that correlation is not causation, which knows that, as Brent's asked in the Q&A, that one individual is not representative of people as a whole. That is the system two, and that is rational. But what Danny Kahneman highlighted was there's also a system one, that's the emotional part of the brain, and that's the one which is driven by biases. So Kahneman spoke about a lot of biases that affect his focus, which was making decisions and choices. My focus is on biases that relate to information, and one particular one, which is really key, is confirmation bias. So that's the temptation to accept something uncritically if it confirms what we would like to be true. And what are the things that we would like to be true? The things that we would like to be true are things that suggest that we can get better, right? So many people genuinely wanting to improve themselves and better themselves. And also, and I might be a little bit more critical here, people who want to get better with easy things that don't cause too much pain. So this is why, again, the number of hours that you put in, that is something that accords with people, because people often say, I spent 2 hours in the gym. Now, it may well be that you were texting on your phone between sets, but if you think you're putting in the time, then you think you're going to get better. Also, the number of hours is easy to measure. I can't really measure the intensity of how hard I worked. Even if I looked at something like my average heart rate, that will become higher if I do something cardio. I could be doing a really difficult weight session or really difficult stretching, and that is still not going to be really registering on my heart rate. So something which is quantifiable and gamified and puts more emphasis on how much time you put in rather than the quality or the difficulty of what you're putting in, that's something which accords with our viewpoint.
You do something which I really like in the book, is that you provide some specific guidance in how, kind of being aware that there's a lot of flimsy research, how can I deal with it? Can you guide us a little bit through this? Like, what can I do as a consumer of research? I read the New York Times, I watch a TED Talk. How, I know this is a big question, so please feel free to take time in answering it. What can I do to figure things out if this research is trustworthy or if it's flimsy, or also just if it applies to me?
Absolutely. So what I try to do in the book is I start with the biases that highlight the problems, but then I go to the solutions. So as Henning, you're asking, what do we do about it? And there's a lot of great books out there which highlight all the different ways in which we can be misinformed and how we can notice them. but they tend to give huge laundry lists of dozens of different ways in which we can be misinformed and dozens of potential solutions. And that can be quite difficult to put it into practice. So what I try to do is to break down the forms of misinformation into just 4. And this is something I structure in what I call the ladder of misinference. That highlights there's 4 different ways in which we will misinterpret information. So the first way is the difference between statements and facts. Somebody says something, but it is not actually true. We need to go back to the original source. So I've already given an example of Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about chess and neurosurgery. When you go to the original source, then you see that it's about violins. Let me give a second sort of even more serious example, just to highlight one of your questions earlier, Henning, is it really bad if just Gladwell encourages us to practice more? There is an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which has been cited 1,600 times, which claims that opioids do not lead to addiction. And so this was one of the papers highly cited to encourage the overprescription of opioids, which has led to the death of 650,000 people in the US alone. That article in the New England Journal of Medicine, a great peer-reviewed journal, was not a peer-reviewed article at all. It was a letter to the editor, 5 sentences long, not vetted, not scrutinized by anybody. A lot of people just cited it because other people were citing it, not checking what was actually said. So the first misstep, a statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. Let's go back to the original source. The second misstep is a fact is not data. It may not be representative. So we might have a single example of a single person being successful, like Steve Jobs, as you mentioned. And Brent also highlights the danger of one single individual who talks about their personal experiences and tries to make this a general set of principles. And indeed, Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, the hedge fund, he wrote a book called Principles, based on what he personally believes to be the secrets to success. And because he's really wealthy, he's using his money and giving donations to business schools, encourage them to teach his principles. But there's no evidence that that works in general. We take a single data point, we learn from success stories, yet we don't know whether those principles work in general. So you might think, well, isn't the solution to look at hundreds of people? But no, because there's the third misstep, which is data is not evidence. So what is data? Data is just a lot of different data points, 100 different success stories and 100 different failures. What is evidence? Well, evidence in a criminal trial is something which supports one particular suspect and rules out other suspects. So evidence is not evidence if it's consistent with many potential suspects. And let me bring it back to the business setting. Let's say we find that more sustainable companies perform better. Well, that could suggest sustainability drives performance, but it's also consistent with alternative suspects. Maybe performance drives sustainability. Once a company's already performing well, then it can invest in sustainability. Or maybe there's other things that affect both. A great CEO both improves performance and she also improves sustainability. So even if we have a large-scale correlation in large-scale data, if it's consistent with many different theories, then it is not evidence which highlights one particular suspect. And the final step is the difference between evidence and proof. So even if we've completely nailed a result, completely shown causation within one particular setting, it might not be universal. It might not apply in other settings. What is a proof? A proof is something universal. When Archimedes proved that the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared, that applies to all circles around the world, whereas evidence only applies in the setting that was originally gathered. Again, evidence in violins may not apply in other areas such as chess. And let me drill down on this point, again, with a very famous business book, the book Grit by Angela Duckworth. That shows that the biggest predictor of success is your grit, your passion and perseverance, not your IQ and not your physical ability. So what she studied was cadets who had been recruited to the US Army, and she tried to predict whether you complete the training, which is called beast barracks. And what she found was grit was a bigger predictor of success than even your physical fitness, which seems surprising. You might think physical fitness, that's really important for the army. But that was something which was evidence, but not proof. She had only taken army recruits. So to be recruited to the army, you have to be extremely fit to begin with. And there's diminishing returns to fitness. So that might be why she found that fitness didn't really matter, but grit mattered. But does that generalize to the ordinary person on the street who is aspiring to get into the army? Maybe not, because for you, it might be more important to work on your fitness rather than honing your grit, because you haven't yet got your fitness to the level to get you into the army to begin with.
I remember, I did not check that study in detail, but I remember that in the NBA, height and performance is actually not highly correlated. But of course, to actually make it into the NBA, right, you need to be so extremely good, in particular if you're not have a high height, right? In general, in basketball, of course, body height and performance is correlated. So you're pointing, you see, like, I really like that argument, and you refer to this a few times in the book, even if kind of the study has internal validity, right? If the results actually kind of address or like capture what is actually going on in a particular setting, they might actually not apply people to people. They might actually not generalize, right? So even if the study by itself is not fraudulent, the kind of insight travels very, very far. Alex, we've talked a lot about things, how things should not be done. I would also kind of like to turn it around and talk about how it can be done. So you refer to your beautiful study in the Journal of Finance on investor mood, and the performance of the stock market, and in particular on the role of soccer games. And I thought it's something which is at the same time incredibly entertaining, but also very kind of insightful in the sense of one learns something about finance markets, but one also learns a lot about how to do good research or to do good kind of understand causal evidence. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the study finds, but also in why it's kind of deals well with kind of establishing a linkage that's actually there.
Thanks for asking about that, Henning. So what the study was trying to look at is the stock market affected by emotions and behavioral factors, not just fundamentals? So that goes within the theme of behavioral finance we've alluded to earlier. And so there were many studies before us who tried to answer that question, and that looked at the link between, say, clock changes and the stock market. The idea being that when the clock changes, people's sleep patterns get disrupted and the market goes down. Or they looked at the effect of weather. They showed that when the market is, when the day is sunny, the market goes up. So there was a strong correlation in those studies, but correlation is not causation. And the problem here is not reverse causality, but it's a problem of data mining. So what is that? You could run hundreds of different tests correlating stock returns with lots of different measures of mood, temperature, rainfall, snowfall, wind, clock changes, lunar cycles, and so on. Maybe one of them happens to be significant, but this is just due to luck. It's a spurious correlation. So what is the best way to try to address concerns of data mining? It's to convince people that you only studied one measure of mood, not hundreds, and you're hiding the other 99 that don't work. And the problems with some of those other measures is people didn't really believe that that was the thing that you'd look at if you wanted to take a measure of mood. So yes, clock changes, they mess up your sleep, but anybody who's worked in a trading floor, and I used to at Morgan Stanley, you know that traders are pretty good at getting by on little sleep. Yes, the weather does affect you if you're a farmer, but if you're a trader, you're working in air-conditioned offices. So this is why I looked at the effect of football, soccer results. So I was on the trading floor in 2004 during the European Championships, and I was in New York. You think Americans don't care about soccer? They were absolutely passionate about it. And being from Europe, the passion is even greater in Europe. There's a lot of existing psychological evidence showing there's huge effects of sports results on mood. Sometimes people actually sadly die or commit suicide because their team happened to lose. And also these studies show that the effects on mood are not confined to your team. It's not, I think, oh, England has a bad team because they lost another penalty shootout. It expands into my feelings on general life. So I had a strong reason to suspect that football results did have a large effect on your emotions, and so this might translate into the stock market. So long story short, that's what we found. We found this strong correlation. But again, there are rival theories. If indeed football results lead to the stock market going down, if you lose a game, the market goes down, is that because of the effect on emotions, or is this because if the football team loses, there's less replica merchandise being sold, or maybe the market knows that people are going to be upset and not working the next day? Maybe you think that the effect is going to be fully rational. So that's why we did some further tests. One of them is we looked at pre-game odds. If indeed it's a fully rational reaction, then a more expected defeat should have less pain than an unexpected one. So England losing to Germany should be less painful than England losing to Iceland. Whereas under the behavioural story, England losing to Germany is just as painful because Germany and England are historic rivals. You might not call them rivals because the rivalry has to be two-sided rather than one-sided, but that's one of the reasons why indeed we looked at pre-game odds. The final thing we also looked at is the effect stronger in stocks that are more likely to be domestically traded? Because this requires the people who trade the UK stock market to be England supporters, and that's going to be more likely true for small companies like Chesnara Insurance, which some people may not have heard of, compared to, say, Vodafone, which lots of non-UK people have heard of. So we did a lot of these tests to make sure that we had addressed those rival theories rather than just honing into our particular interpretation of the data.
I think this is something we have seen more in the last kind of 20, 25 years, right? Very much kind of driven by research and economics, by Kruger and so on, right? That we kind of basically leverage some random variation in the world to get like a better understanding, right? We're using some form of a natural experiment, so to speak. The odd thing about it, and I think this is in a certain way, Alex, right? The contrast has gotten so big, right? Between what is done in kind of cutting edge research nowadays, right? Where we actually see a lot of natural experiments, a lot of field experiments, right? And on the other hand, what we see in like kind of single account kind of case studies, so to speak, right? Where people basically kind of share their thoughts in TED Talks and so on. What I would love to do is to bring in a little bit more. We've accumulated a few kind of questions in the Q&A section. I would love to kind of start getting into a little bit. Like let's start off with Alexander here, Alexander Heidinger, and he asked the question like, if you have any thoughts, it's a question from 10 or 5 or 3 or 5 your time. What will Gen AI do in this context for us? Like, what do you expect Gen AI to be like on misinformation, on people's consumption, and so on? Can I know this is speculation at this point, but given of what we know now, can you speculate a little bit, Alex, on the role of AI on this? I think you're muted now.
Yes, I certainly can. Thank you so much to the engagement. It's really great to have these questions, and a few others have asked about AI as well. So I think AI can be a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, AI could be a solution to misinformation. Why? What that can do is to search for lots of different studies out there and avoid the problem of latching onto one particular study because we like its findings. So AI, if this is indeed able to look at the general scientific consensus, that might be something which is able to just avoid the problem of being swayed by one particular study. But unfortunately, AI could also contribute to misinformation, right? We already know that in a pre-AI world, often people are misquoted. So the likes of Albert Einstein or Mark Twain or Thomas Edison, often quotes are attributed, which they never actually said. And if people use generative AI in particular to try to spread misinformation, if they wrote an article in the style of a particular author or scientist, then that might be something which ends up being spread. So I think just like anything, there's costs and benefits. What's the cost of having a car as a method of transport to replace horses? Clearly, on the one hand, it's faster. On the other hand, it can be more dangerous. And so with AI, I think there will be a double-edged sword here. The challenge for people who are more knowledgeable about AI than me is to try to harness the benefits of AI in combating misinformation while also making sure that we don't have the downsides.
I like your example of kind of people get attributed things. There's a famous quote by the baseball player Yogi Berra who said, "I really didn't say everything I said." So how things often get attributed to him. Constanze had a question. You've already alluded to this, Alex, but I think it's so important because it's really about the implication of your book. Her third question at the beginning of the webinar. And she asked, could you provide a practical example of how an ordinary individual could apply your techniques to a real world scenario? And I give like two examples, which I recall on top of my head from the book, that you basically suggest to look for biases of the person, like the person who's providing the information. And I think you mentioned superlatives as an example. But look, you see, like, imagine for people who are not kind of researchers, who are not at a business school or at a university, who typically don't read a lot of academic studies, what are like the few things I can immediately do to figure out if I should trust some research?
Right. As you mentioned, Henning, I provided a lot of different examples, but let me just focus on one because we've got lots of great questions. I want to make sure that we have time for the others. So let me give you one particular tip. So when you see research, and again, this is not necessarily reading an academic paper, but reading a newspaper article or blog, if it's something you would like to be true, imagine it showed the opposite results and think about how you could knock it down. So you've alluded to breastfeeding, but I haven't yet used a breastfeeding example. But normally people say breastfeeding leads to higher IQ in babies. And people want that to be true because they think you should feed your babies naturally. Let's say we found the opposite result. Breastfeeding leads to lower IQ. You don't like that result. So how would you try to knock it down? You would start thinking of these alternative suspects, these rival theories. And maybe one you'd suggest is, well, maybe the women who breastfeed, they could be poorer women. They can't afford to buy formula, so that's why they have to go with breastfeeding. And maybe it's poverty, not actual breastfeeding, which causes the lower IQ. So now that you've alerted yourself to the possibility of rival theories, ask yourself, do the same rival theories apply, even though the result that is being paraded is in the direction that you want? So the common result is breastfeeding leads to higher IQ. Could indeed family poverty be the driver of both? And the answer is yes. Maybe it is wealthier families who can tend to breastfeed because breastfeeding is exhausting. It requires a lot of family support. Maybe you have a husband, or maybe you are able to hire nannies to allow you to breastfeed. And maybe it's that family wealth which is causing the superior outcomes, not the feeding method. And so why I think this is so useful is that we have the solutions within us. But you might think about studies and statistics. You might think, I don't have a PhD in statistics. How can I ever, as a normal person, address misinformation? There is not a single equation in the book. All I'm asking is common sense. Whenever I or anybody else shares a study on LinkedIn that we don't want to be true, there is no shortage of comments explaining why it might be wrong, why correlation is not causation, why indeed there are alternative explanations. So we have the ability to provide alternative explanations ourselves. We just need to trigger it and overcome our biases, and how we trigger it is imagine the opposite result was true.
Wendy had a question, and I know you have a good answer, but I think it's a very good question because it puts your own kind of approach to test a little bit. Wendy asked at 3:13 your time, while I agree with your statement that findings of research which reinforce our own beliefs, we tend to judge as better, reliable, while those which go against our beliefs, we will tend to reject. Do you actually have empirical proof of this hypothesis?
Yeah, and I really appreciate this challenge, Wendy. You should absolutely hold me to the same standards that I'm trying to hold other papers to. So there's a couple of papers that I refer to in my book which have empirical evidence. I'd never say proof because proof is universal, but let me just give you one example of evidence. So this was a study where they took some undergraduates with some views on gun control. So some were highly pro-gun control and some were highly anti. And they randomly gave them a series of studies, some of them which supported gun control and others which opposed gun control. And importantly, they randomized the studies. None of them were clearly better than the other. Why? They took the same study and changed one from increases crime to decreases crime as being the consequence of gun control. Now, everybody saw exactly one study, which was pro-gun, and one study that was anti-gun, and they were asked to evaluate the quality of those studies, and people almost always was to evaluate the one that supported their viewpoint as being of higher quality than the one that opposed their viewpoint. And also they were asked, after looking at those two studies, whether their views on gun control had changed. You would think that they should have moderated their views. Why? They'd seen exactly one pro and one anti-study. They'd seen a balance of studies. So if they were extreme, they should have moved towards the center. Instead, they moved further away from the center. This is something known as belief polarization. Why? They latched onto the one study that they really liked. They'd ignored the study that they didn't. And that's consistent with your question, Wendy, about focusing on the studies that confirm your beliefs and dismissing those that contradict it.
Sudeep Rangi has a question. This is 3:42 your time, and by the way, excellent former EMBA student of mine. If you were dean of a top-tier business school, committed to providing a world-class education that surpasses the flimsy research standard, or otherwise said, an evidence-based education, what research programs, departments would you subsidize, and which departments, disciplines would you cut? And would you advocate to continue case study methodology, even though it seems to be quite susceptible to being flimsy research? I feel like I'm getting my popcorn out here, Alex. I'm excited.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. I think first I'd say you talk about flimsy research and case studies. Actually, case studies are used for teaching rather than research. And so that's one of the things that I would change immediately, is that we are evaluated only according to research at business schools, not really teaching, which is a huge shame because you as students, you pay our salaries. So I would change that. So then my broader answer to the question is I don't think I would completely cut certain departments or subsidize others, but I would change the way in which faculty are evaluated. First, I think we should be evaluated not just on academic research, but on our teaching. Also, our research should not just be evaluated according to impact on academia, but impact on the real world. So we work at business schools, not at economics departments or philosophy departments. Our alumni generously give a lot of money to fund our research, and many of them want research to be practical. Okay, but then how does this make sure that it doesn't go to the other extreme of being just flimsy research, which has a real world impact because it shows what you would like to be true? So I think this is obviously much more difficult, but one thing that you would try to highlight is the research backed up by papers? So is your public engagement backed up by papers published in top peer review journals? So I typically work on sustainability, not because sustainability is hot and I'm jumping on the bandwagon, but because I published many academic articles on sustainability. Now I'm working on misinformation, again, not because it's hot, but because I've served as an editor of a top-tier journal, and I also have worked on behavioral economics. But there are people who jump on the sustainability bandwagon, or who now speak about things like AI, because AI is really popular. even though they don't have research on this. So I would try to make sure that if we are giving people credit for a Wall Street Journal article or for an FT op-ed or for a podcast, that all of these things are based on underlying academic research rather than just saying something which sounds good and then people believing you because you have the title of professor at a top school.
I have two more questions. I'll take one more from the Q&A part here from Gustavo at 3:36 your time. This is a fantastic session. Thank you, Gustavo. Can Alex share a few widely known accepted research results that are actually solid, robust, in opposition of the 10,000 to mastery example? So rather than kind of debunking stuff, like some studies where you would say, and you have a few great studies in the book, like a few things where you say, like, look, this is well done and important findings you enjoy and like.
Yeah, so I'll first start with 10,000 hours and I'll go back to the Anders Ericsson paper, which is on the role of deliberate practice and expert performance. Yes, it's only based on violins, but it's much more nuanced than it suggests. It highlights the importance of deliberate practice, not just hours put in. And then Anders Ericsson himself wrote his own book, which was partly a response to Outliers. The book is called Peak. And it has a chapter saying, no, the 10,000 hours rule wasn't really a rule, highlighting what his paper does find, not how it's misinterpreted. But let me just give a second example, which is completely different from that, which is a paper by Marianne Bertrand and Sendel Mulanathan on discrimination. And I believe the title was, Are Greg and Emily More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? And what they wanted to look at was the effect of racial discrimination on employment outcomes. So if you just showed that African Americans get fewer jobs than Caucasians, is this racism, or is this the fact that African Americans and Caucasians might be fundamentally different? Like if Asians are less in the NBA, that could not be discrimination. It could just be that Asians are shorter and people are selecting on height. So what they did is they did something similar to that gun control study I mentioned in my answer to Wendy. They took people's resumes and they randomly assigned a African-American sounding name like Lakeisha and Jamal and a Caucasian sounding name like Greg and Emily to the resumes. So they had identical resumes, but with different names, and they sent this out to various employers. And what they found was having an African-American sounding name was significantly less likely to give you an invitation to interview, even for the same CV.
Alex, we are almost at the end. I would like to end a little bit on like a personal question. This is a very kind of challenging fight you have kind of signed up for, right? You're like, like debunking misinformation, so to speak, doesn't make you a lot of friends, right? It's much easier to put some flimsy research out in the world to actually then debunk it. And one looks a little bit like you pointed this out in the beginning, right? You said like you point a finger at someone and immediately three fingers point in your direction, right? You must have had a lot of kind of fingers pointing in your direction. Alex, how do you manage in kind of keeping up your energy to stay positive, to stay joyful as you engage in this work?
Actually, I have had fewer fingers pointed at me than you might think. And I really appreciate your concern. I really appreciate your question. And I think the reason for this could be because I'm seen as a pro-sustainability advocate. I'm also an ethnic minority. So if I highlight some of the concerns with, say, diversity studies, it's not because I'm racist or sexist. And therefore, people can see that my intent is constructive rather than ideological. And so that might make it harder for someone to say, cancel me, to use the common language. But also I think about what is our role as academics and why are we so lucky to have this thing called tenure, which is the job from which you can never be fired. It is to allow you to speak up for the truth, in contrast to, say, Galileo Galilei, who was imprisoned for saying that the world was, that the sun was the center of the earth. So these are things where we are given a privileged position, and that privileged position is something that we could just take advantage of and exploit and say we can do it what we ever want to. We don't need to work hard, and we won't get fired, or to say it's a privilege to be in this position, and maybe there's not many people who can speak out on these topics, either because they don't research in sustainability or because they aren't able to communicate it clearly to the real world. And I really appreciate your comments on the readability of the book. And that's something I really wanted to work on, is to highlight these things are not just statistical small points. These are relevant and important to the real world. And again, that's why it's so gratifying that so many people have signed on to this webinar.
This would be it, Alex. The next person we have, I just got confirmation this morning, is the great Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford University. Jeff Pfeffer has been...
That's fantastic. I'm really a big fan of his work. Great job for getting him.
Thank you so much. So Jeff is a bit of a legend. He has been kind of the primary scholar on power, on how to get things done. I just put the link in the chat. If you want to register, do so now. My guess is we will hit again kind of capacity on that. The link is not yet officially out, so I just shared in the chat for everybody who kind of participated today. You will see on the link, no pictures yet up. I just kind of created this. Alex, in the name of all the participants of the webinar, in my personal name, and honestly, even broader than that, I think the work you do is very, very important for society. Kind of debunking misinformation is one of the kind of great tasks of today. So thank you so much for taking this on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanging. Really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Great to have you. Bye.
Bye-bye.